You know, if you stop and think about it, we spend almost our entire lives navigating this massive, really complex maze of invisible walls.
Yeah, we really do.
I mean, we sit at red lights at 3 in the morning when absolutely no one is coming. We naturally lower our voices the second we step into a library.
Right, it's just automatic.
Exactly. We follow social contracts, unwritten moral boundaries, and complex legal systems because we all silently, collectively agree that those walls exist. It's basically the operating system of human civilization.
It is. It's the shared imagination that keeps society from just descending into total chaos. We rely on those predictable structures.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they make the world feel safe and navigable for you and me.
But imagine someone who looks at all those invisible walls, realizes the electricity powering them is actually turned off, and decides that stepping right through them isn't just like a clever shortcut. It's the absolute only way to become a king in this world.
It's a terrifying thought, honestly.
Today, we're going on a deep dive into the mind of a man who did exactly that. We're exploring a fascinating and frankly deeply disturbing historical movement through a single, very specific lens.
And that lens is a translated lecture by Professor Jiang Ruotgen.
Right. We are looking at an 18th century religious figure named Jacob Frank and his movement, Sabbatine Frankism.
Now, we should probably warn you listening, this is not some dry, dusty history lesson about an obscure theologian.
No, definitely not.
According to Professor Jiang's lecture, Jacob Frank wasn't just a heretic. He was a master architect of psychological warfare.
Our mission today is to unpack the specific mechanisms of that warfare. We're going to look at how Frank used subversive storytelling, the deliberate and explosive breaking of social taboos, and extreme secrecy to build what the professor describes as a massive, world-altering shadow empire.
A shadow empire that allegedly still has echoes today.
Exactly. Now, before we really jump into the deep end, a vital note for you listening. This lecture contains some highly charged historical, religious, and political claims, some of which actually touch on modern geopolitics.
Very sensitive topics.
Right. So our goal in this deep dive is absolutely not to endorse or validate the professor's viewpoints or his historical conclusions as absolute fact. We are here purely to impartially report on and analyze the fascinating psychological concepts and the very controversial theories presented in this specific source material.
We're looking at the mechanics of the arguments, essentially.
Yes, exactly. We are analyzing the blueprint of a philosophy, taking apart the engine to see how it runs, regardless of how controversial the vehicle turned out to be. Okay, let's unpack this.
To understand how Frank managed to convince thousands of people to eagerly break every rule in the book, we have to look at the religious landscape he stepped into.
Right, set the stage for us.
So we are in the 18th century. This is about 50 years after the death of another incredibly radical religious figure named Sabbatai Zevi. And Frank emerges on the scene and brazenly declares, "I am the reincarnation of Zevi."
Which is a huge claim to make.
Massive. Now, Sabbatinism wasn't just some quirky offshoot. It was an active theological rebellion that believed the Messiah, meaning Zevi, had already arrived, but it ultimately failed and converted to Islam under pressure.
Which is wild.
It is. And this left his followers in a state of profound spiritual whiplash and, cognitive dissonance. Frank was actually born into one of these Sabbatean families.
But he didn't exactly embrace the traditional lifestyle, did he?
Not at all. He possessed this visceral hatred for traditional Judaism and its strict adherence to religious laws.
He looked at the endless lists of rules, the dietary restrictions, the behavioral codes, and he essentially just saw a trap.
He built his entire philosophy on a concept attributed to Jesus. The idea that the world is a corpse.
A corpse. Wow.
Yeah. To Jacob Frank, the material world, all its physical rules, its social hierarchies, its limitations, they simply did not matter. It was dead tissue.
So what did matter to him?
The only thing of actual value was the divine spark hidden inside the individual.
And the traditional religious view at the time, and really across many religions even today, was essentially you are here on earth to learn spirituality.
Right. You gain wisdom through suffering.
Exactly. Through discipline and through denying yourself earthly pleasures. You put your head down, you follow the rules, and you wait for the next life for your reward.
But Frank looks at that setup and asks a very dangerous question.
He says, wait a minute. If God is forgiving and just wants us to learn, why do we have to do it by suffering? Why can't we just break the rules, bypass the pain, and be kings right now in the material world?
Which is incredibly seductive.
He makes me think of an early growth hacker or maybe a video game modder.
Oh, a video game modder is the perfect way to look at his psychology.
Right. Think about how a modder looks at a game. The established game of life has rules programmed by society. You grind, you suffer, you level up incredibly slowly through strict adherence to the laws.
You play by the developer's rules.
But Frank looks at the code of the game and realizes it's completely arbitrary. He says, "This grind is for suckers. I'm going to find the cheat codes."
He's hacking the underlying system.
Yes, to gain immediate massive power instead of playing by the intended rules.
What's fascinating here is how that completely shifts the religious paradigm from passive to hyperactive. He took a framework that was entirely based on spiritual waiting, on patience and suffering, and violently pivoted it toward material conquest.
He completely flipped the script.
He really did. He was laying the groundwork for a religion that wasn't about piety at all. It was about sheer success, domination, and strategically aligning yourself with power, specifically befriending European nobility.
But you don't just walk up to deeply religious people in the 1700s and say, "Hey, forget all your deeply held morals, let's go be rich rule breakers," and expect them to follow you.
No, they would chase him out of town.
Exactly. A hacker needs to convince others to download his corrupted software. And he didn't do it with dry theological essays. He used stories to rewire their brains.
Frank was a total master of narrative manipulation, but he didn't view stories as mere entertainment or like simple parables.
How did he view them?
The lecture highlights his core belief that stories are like seeds. You plant a carefully crafted, subversive story in someone's mind, and you just leave it there.
And it grows.
Over time, it grows into a massive oak tree that literally alters the landscape of how they perceive reality. It changes their internal operating system.
The source material gives us a couple of wild examples of this technique. The first is the orange and the knife story.
Oh, this one is great.
It's the Sabbath, and Frank is just casually peeling an orange with a knife, completely violating the strict rules against working or carrying tools on that day.
Right in front of everyone.
Yeah. A strict Jewish scholar walks up with his disciples and harshly scolds him. Frank nods, agrees with the scholar's theology, but then slyly asks, "Well, if the law is so strict, why do you have a knife?"
The scholar is deeply offended, of course.
He says he just bathed and changed into his finest clothes. He obviously wouldn't carry a knife. But Frank tells him to check his pocket.
And what happens?
The scholar reaches in, finds a knife, and completely loses his mind. He's so amazed by this quote-unquote miracle that he declares Frank must be the Messiah, and Frank just dismisses him, essentially calling him an ass.
And then there's the pearl story. A wealthy merchant has a priceless pearl and wants a hole drilled in it to make jewelry.
Right.
He goes to all the master artisans, the absolute experts in the city, and they all refuse. They're terrified of breaking something so valuable and ruining their reputations.
Because the stakes are so high.
Exactly. Then Frank, who frames himself in this story as an ignorant, uneducated apprentice, just steps up, takes the pearl, drills the hole without a second of hesitation, and becomes incredibly rich from the reward.
Okay, I have to push back on the first story here.
Go for it.
I mean, I'm reading this, and the orange thing. He literally just slipped a knife into the guy's pocket while he was distracted. It's pickpocketing in reverse.
It absolutely is.
It's a cheap street corner parlor trick. How does a sleight of hand illusion equate to a profound philosophy that helps build a shadow empire?
Because the trick itself is the entire point. Frank wasn't claiming to have magical powers to manifest knives. He was demonstrating a raw psychological truth to his followers watching this happen.
What truth?
He was proving to them that people, even the most educated, rule-bound scholars, are fundamentally superstitious and easily manipulated.
He's showing them the exploit in the code.
Precisely. The scholar's strict adherence to the law didn't make him wise. It made him predictable and blind. The law created a rigid pattern of behavior which Frank, the hacker, easily exploited. And the Pearl story works on the exact same psychological mechanism. It teaches his followers that the world doesn't actually reward conventional expertise or cautious rule following. The world bends to sheer, unadulterated audacity.
So if you're willing to just grab the drill while everyone else is paralyzed by the imaginary rules, you win. You dictate reality because everyone else is too afraid to act.
Yes. He is systematically proving to his followers, through these planted seeds, that the laws governing society are entirely arbitrary, and the people enforcing those laws are fools who can be easily bypassed.
Okay, so Frank proved the rules were arbitrary, but ignoring the rules just makes you a social outcast. To build an empire, he had to take it a massive step further.
He really did.
He had to convince his followers that breaking the rules wasn't just a clever loophole, it was a divine mandate. The lecture calls this the theology of transgression, or justification by sin.
It is a complete 180-degree inversion of traditional morality. Frank argued that you actually prove your faith and your spiritual worth by deliberately shattering human laws and societal conventions.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly a bit mind-bending. According to the lecture, Frank posits this theological argument with Elohim, with the divine.
Right.
He asks a fundamental question. Why did God create man in a physical body? And his answer is that God created man to experience flesh, to experience physical pleasure, and crucially, to experience sin.
That sounds so counterintuitive.
It does. But he argues that the act of sinning generates a unique type of raw data, of visceral wisdom and knowledge that a purely spiritual, perfect God cannot attain on his own.
It's a terrifyingly brilliant manipulation of theology. He's basically telling his followers, God needs you to sin.
Like God is a data broker harvesting our transgressions.
Exactly. God requires the data you gather by breaking the rules. If you just follow the laws, you remain a useless fool. But if you actively break the rules, you are gathering critical, profound knowledge that you are essentially gifting back to the divine.
He even rewrites classic religious texts to fit this narrative. He takes the story of the Garden of Eden and St. Augustine's famous story about stealing pears as a youth.
Oh yeah, he turns those completely upside down.
Right. In the traditional versions, you and I know these as cautionary tales about the fall of man and the inherent flawed evil of humanity. But Frank twists them entirely.
What does he say?
He says, no, God wanted Adam and Eve to eat the fruit. God wanted Augustine to steal the pears. God wants us to test the limits, to be creative, to break human rules, with the one single caveat being that you shouldn't kill people.
Well, that's somewhat comforting, I guess. But this specific theology leads directly into what the lecture describes as religious accelerationism.
Accelerationism, explain that.
Frank taught that the current world is essentially an oppressive, false reality created by Satan, or maybe an incompetent false god. And by committing sins, by systematically shattering every social taboo you can find, you are waking yourself and others up from this illusion.
You're breaking the conditioning.
Yes. Think about the shock to the system when you do something profoundly forbidden. In that moment of pure transgression, Frank argued, the illusion of the false world shatters. You reveal the falseness of society's rules.
So by doing evil, they believed they were actually defeating Satan and accelerating the end of the world.
Right.
And in their view, the end of the world wasn't a fiery apocalypse. It was the dawn of a new era of absolute physical paradise, where they, the rule breakers, would have ultimate power and pleasure.
They managed to twist the most taboo, abhorrent behaviors into a noble, heroic, world-saving quest.
It's the ultimate rationalization for extreme narcissism. But, I mean, it raises a massive logistical problem for a cult leader.
It sure does.
If you tell a group of people that the entire world is an illusion and their divine mission is to be as selfish and transgressive as humanly possible, that group should self-destruct in a matter of days.
Oh, they should absolutely tear each other apart.
Exactly. If the golden rule of your community is break all the rules and take what you want, how do you keep that community from just burning itself to the ground? How does a leader maintain iron-fisted control over a mob of deliberate sinners?
You have to fundamentally rewire their understanding of reality itself. And then you bind them together with psychological chains so thick they can never break them.
How did you do that?
Frank achieved the first part through his interpretation of Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism. The lecture explains Frank's view that reality isn't made of physical matter. It's made of consciousness, its vibrations. It is a shared hallucination that we all just agree on.
The nun's story illustrates this perfectly. According to the source, Frank decided he wanted to sleep with a Catholic nun, someone who had taken the strictest possible vows of chastity.
And he didn't even try to talk to her first, right?
No. The story goes that he didn't seduce her or trick her. He simply visualized the outcome, lay down, and violently imposed his imagination onto the world. And because he believed his reality was stronger than hers, she eventually broke her vows and came to him.
It's an insane story.
But the psychological lesson for his followers was profound. If you act like a king, if you absolutely ignore the taboos as if they simply don't exist, the rest of the world will eventually buckle under the weight of your hallucination and treat you like a king.
But to gain real institutional power in the 18th century, visualization wasn't enough. They needed massive political backing.
Right.
So Frank and his predominantly Jewish followers made a shocking, highly calculated move. They converted en masse to Catholicism,
But not out of some newfound love for the Pope.
purely for royal sponsorship and political protection from the European nobility, and the secret conversion ceremony they held amongst themselves before officially converting. Well, it's intense.
The lecture describes a bizarre, highly secretive ritual. They gathered together, stripped entirely naked, nailed across to a bench, blew out all the candles, and engaged in group sexual acts.
On the surface, that just sounds like an excuse for pure debauchery.
Yeah, wild party.
But sociologically, mechanically, it was the glue that built his empire. By forcing his followers to commit an act so fundamentally abhorrent to their own Jewish identities and simultaneously blasphemous to the Catholic faith they were about to publicly adopt, he completely shattered their previous moral frameworks.
So he generates this crushing, overwhelming guilt and cognitive dissonance, but instead of letting that trauma destroy them, he weaponizes it.
Exactly.
If you believe you are already damned by the standards of both your old life and your new public life, you have absolutely nothing left to lose.
You are totally isolated, you can't return to your old society because of what you've done, and you are actively lying to your new Catholic protectors. The sheer trauma of that extreme secret isolates the group entirely.
It's like jumping out of an airplane and realizing your instructor packed your parachute with rocks. You can't go back up to the plane.
You're just falling.
Yeah. You have no choice but to trust the madman falling next to you who promises he can teach you how to fly before you hit the ground. You pour all that frantic energy into blind loyalty to him.
And Frank capitalized on that isolation. The lecture details other extreme practices, wife swapping, which Frank bizarrely framed as a way to empower women to manipulate powerful men.
That's so twisted.
And even more disturbing, incest. Frank impregnated his own daughter, Eva, whom he declared the female Messiah, claiming he was creating a pure vessel for reincarnation.
These horrifying acts bound them in an unspeakable secrecy. And because of that, their organizational structure was totally unique. The lecture notes that the hierarchy was incredibly flat.
What do you mean by flat?
It wasn't a pyramid with lieutenants and middle managers. It was just Jacob Frank at the top as the absolute ultimate authority, and all the brothers and sisters perfectly equal beneath him.
Wow.
They were united in their secret trauma against a world they believed was an illusion. It sounds exactly like the mechanics of modern high-control groups or extreme internet echo chambers, where isolation and shared radical beliefs make the members incredibly resilient and highly motivated.
Which brings us to the most explosive claims in Professor Jiang's lecture, the long-term cultural aftershocks of this shadow empire.
Yeah, this is where it really branches out.
We move from secret, traumatic rituals in the 18th century to the professor's claim that this philosophy fundamentally infiltrated and shaped the modern world.
The lecture alleges that Frankists, using their mastery of absolute secrecy and their belief that they could adapt to any outward religion or political system while keeping their true goals hidden, infiltrated massive global structures.
They were like chameleons.
Right. The professor claims they moved into the Jesuits, into Freemasonry, and even influenced the structural DNA of later movements like Mormonism and Scientology.
There's even the rumor mentioned in the source that Frank actually founded the Illuminati, acting as the nexus point combining Jewish mysticism, Masonic networks, and Catholic influence.
It's a huge claim.
And the professor claims that famous historical figures were secret Frankists, specifically naming U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, and strongly suggesting there are many more unnamed powerful Americans steering society today.
The lecture also points to massive cultural influences. Take Goethe's masterpiece, Faust.
The quintessential story of the scholar who makes a literal deal with the devil.
Right. Faust sins terribly. He abuses a young girl, causes death and destruction, all in the relentless pursuit of ultimate forbidden wisdom. But at the end of the play, instead of being dragged down to hell for his crimes, God actually saves him.
Which is fascinating.
The lecture argues this is a distinctly Frankist worldview hiding in plain sight, that sinning to gain profound knowledge is ultimately rewarded by the divine, not punished.
The lecture also quotes a striking poem by W.B. Yeats' Crazy Jane Talks with a Bishop. There's a specific visceral line, "Love has pitched his mansion in the place of excrement."
Wow, that's quite an image.
It is, and that line perfectly encapsulates the core Sabbatine Frankist theology. The idea that to find true recreation, to truly find God, you cannot remain clean, polite, and rule-bound.
You have to get dirty.
You must willingly descend into the absolute lowest, darkest, most taboo places of human existence. You have to hit absolute rock bottom to find the divine spark.
We have to pause here because Professor Jiang makes one final massive claim that connects this history to modern geopolitics.
And it's a very heavy claim.
He claims that Sabbatean Frankist philosophy directly influenced the founders of the State of Israel, and that this philosophy is the hidden narrative shaping the modern Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Right.
Now, as a reminder to you listening, our job today is just to hold up the blueprint of Jiang's argument so we can look at it. We are analyzing his historical thesis and his philosophical connections. We are not endorsing this as established historical fact.
It is a deeply provocative claim attempting to tie 18th century mystical transgression directly to 20th and 21st century geopolitical conflict. It requires viewing complex modern statecraft entirely through the lens of an obscure, ancient psychological cult.
So what does this all mean? We have a guy who convinced people they had to sin to save the world, who used sleight-of-hand tricks to break down educated scholars, and whose movement allegedly spawned the Illuminati, influenced Supreme Court justices, and shaped modern literature.
It's a lot to take in.
How do we, sitting here today, process these massive claims?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to separate the literal historical conspiracy theories from the psychological reality.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Whether or not Jacob Frank secretly founded the Illuminati, or whether his bloodline infiltrated every level of global power, is highly debated, deeply controversial history. But Frank's core psychological insight, the mechanism he used to hack human behavior, is undeniably real.
And it has absolutely permeated modern Western thought.
Exactly.
The realization that societal power comes from boldly defying conformity.
Yes. That the rules of society are just a shared narrative. If you have the sheer audacity to rewrite the agreed-upon narrative and the charisma to get others to believe your version of reality, you can bend the world to your will.
He basically weaponized the concept of the post-truth reality centuries before we had a word for it on the internet.
He was way ahead of his time, in the darkest way possible.
To summarize this deep dive, Jacob Frank wasn't just a religious heretic. Through the lens of Professor Jiang's lecture, we see an architect of psychological warfare.
A total hacker.
Right. He understood that humans are constrained by imaginary social walls. He used stories to plant seeds of doubt, radical transgression to shatter moral boundaries, and extreme traumatic secrecy to bind a community together, allegedly infiltrating global power structures along the way.
His methods were extreme, abhorrent, and deeply manipulative. But his understanding of human nature, our susceptibility to audacious confidence, our willingness to trade morality for material power, and the incredibly fragile nature of our social conventions is startlingly sharp.
And that brings us back to where we started, to you listening right now.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this on your commute or while you're working, think about the invisible walls you navigate every single day. We live in an era obsessed with narrative building, with disruption, with hacking the system.
It's everywhere.
Frank's story is a dark, distorted mirror held up to that exact modern impulse.
It leaves us with a necessary, if uncomfortable, question. If society's laws, its moral boundaries, and its power structures are largely based on a shared, collective imagination, what invisible walls are you accepting as solid reality in your own life today?
And perhaps more importantly, if you aren't the one actively writing the story of your reality, who is?
Something to think about the next time you're sitting alone at a red light in the middle of the night.